Hello, my name is Danny Williams. I'm in Orono, Maine. Today is June 20th, 2013. And today I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story, and it's about me. I'm an adopted child, and about 22 years ago, I did a search for my biological family. Now, one of the questions that is asked about being adopted is, did I know that I was adopted? And the answer is yes. I've known I was adopted my entire life. There was never a time when my parents, or that I can remember, that my parents sat me down and told me that I was adopted. What's interesting is that my parents didn't think they could have children at the time I was adopted. 2 years later, my mother got pregnant and had a child, and then a second child. So I have two brothers that are biological to my parents, and I, of course, am not biological to my parents. So the reason I decided to search for my biological family initially was for medical reasons. And that's a very common thing for children who are adopted, to want to know about their genetics. That's something, obviously, that I didn't know anything about. So although that was the initial reason I decided to search, as I began to search and as I began to learn more about adopted children and parents who give children up for adoption, I learned that there's much more to it. That at a very fundamental level, this was a search about who I am as a person. Where do I come from? A very basic and a very fundamental question that most people know the answer to, but I did not. And growing up, there was never an issue in being adopted. There were no family issues related to my adoption. And I never felt like there was anything missing. I was raised in a wonderful, loving home, caring home, and I never realized there was something missing until I did this search, and I sort of put that piece into place. So I'll take you back to 1991, which was about when I started to think about doing this search. And my parents had always, as I said, I always knew I was adopted, and I knew I was adopted in New York. And so when I started thinking about searching for my biological family, I wrote some information, I wrote and requested some information from the adoption agency. This was a private adoption, and the agency sent me some literature, and that literature sat on my desk for about 2.5 years before I did anything. And 1993, going into 1994, I was a graduate student here at the University of Maine. And one of the reasons adopted children, there are many reasons that adopted children decide to search for their family or their biological family, but one of the reasons is there's an event typically at around the age that I was, which was at that point 22, 23, 24. That's the age when a lot of times people are getting married, they're having children, a parent dies, or some major life event occurs that sort of gives you pause to think and reflect about who am I, where am I going? You know, these big questions, these big life questions. And in 1994, I was going to be done graduate school, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. So these big questions about life and the existence of life and what am I going to do in life came up. And so so in 1991, I requested the information, but it sat and I didn't do anything until about 1993, 94, when these questions started to come up. At that time, my parents, who raised me, I refer to them as my parents. My parents were divorced. My mother was living in Florida and decided she was going to return to Maine. And the combination of her coming back to Maine, me entering my last year into graduate school, I thought it's time for me to do this search. And I didn't want to do this search without my mother. And obviously, for my mother, this was a very a very emotional experience for her, because she didn't know what the outcome was, even though I assured her and reassured her that I was not looking for another family, nor was I interested in running off with other people. This was very threatening for her, but even so, she was very supportive. And her coming back to Maine gave me the little nudge that I needed to move forward. So I started my search back at the adoption agency. By law, in the state of New York, adoption agencies have to provide what is called non-identifying information, which is, as it sounds, information about my biological parents that does not identify them. I obviously checked with the adoption agency to see if they had contacted the agency or left a note in the file to say that when I was of age, which I believe was 18, if I contacted them, they gave me permission. They would have had to have left a note to give the adoption agency permission to give me their information. There was no such note. So I requested the non-identifying information in the summer of '93, and by late fall of '93, I received this information that told me a lot about the circumstances around my adoption. I was 6 weeks old when I was adopted, so I lived in foster care for 6 weeks. I generally had a healthy birth. They gave me a little bit of medical history about my biological family's medical history. They told me a little bit of information about my biological mother, that her name is Karen. She was the eldest of 3 children, both of whom were sisters, and my biological father, who was named Jeff. They obviously did not give me their last name, because that would have identified them. But it was 2 or 3 pages of information, some of which my mother knew and some of which she didn't know. So this was the end of the fall of '93, and I decided that at that time I was going to New York, usually between Christmas and New Year's, to visit a cousin. And I decided that this year, when I went to New York, I was going to try to step up my search a little bit. And I should mention that all the while, I was receiving some counsel from a person who specialized in helping children search for their adopted children. And she was in Maine. And she was a licensed therapist, and I can't remember exactly how I found her, but we found each other. And she gave me some books to read. She really helped me with some literature and helped me focus my search. So I went to New York, and I again went to the adoption agency. Before I went, my mother, who had always thought that she knew what my last name would have been, and I had never asked her, before I left, I asked her. And, excuse me, she said she thought my last name would have been Busen. She didn't know how it was spelled, but armed with that information and the non-identifying information that I'd received a month or so earlier, off to New York I went around Christmas time, 1993. I had an appointment with the adoption agency, and they asked me a lot of questions about why I wanted to do this, and the standard kind of questions that you might expect. They gave me a tour of the facility. They showed me where I would have been weighed as a baby and some of the time. It was a very interesting experience. And obviously, the person at the adoption agency couldn't tell me much, although she did tell me my biological mother and father's date of birth. Apparently, the criteria for non-identifying information had changed, and now date of birth was included in that. So I actually had a fair amount of information, but remember, this was before the internet. So there was no Google. There were no search engines. I had to go to the source. So the lady at Spence Chapin actually referred me to a person in New York City who again, was set up to help children search for their biological families. And as it turns out, he was also a therapist and lived 2 blocks away from where I was staying. So I immediately went to see him, and he was of immense help. The first thing he asked me was, "Do you have your birth certificate?" And the answer was, I did. And the birth certificate that I was issued was the birth certificate that I was given when I was born. However, when I was adopted, the birth certificate was changed to reflect my new name. So even though the birth certificate was had my name on it, it was the original birth certificate that was issued when I was born. So I had to go and somehow match up this birth certificate with a birth index that lived in New York City, in the New York City Public Library. Again, in paper form. It was in a book. He told me that it would have taken 12 hours to search it by hand. So there off I go to the New York City Public Library with my birth certificate, and I start with the B's because I thought, my mother had said, we thought your last name would have been something like Busen. So after about 20 minutes, the birth index has names, it's an alphabetical listing, date of birth, gender, and it has the important thing, the code, a certain section of the code from your birth certificate. So if I could match my birth certificate with a name in that book, I would have a big clue as to who I was looking for. And sure enough, about 20 minutes into my search, into the B's, I found my name. And it was Lawrence Scott Busen. And all the numbers matched, all the dates matched. So I went back to this fellow in New York that was helping me, and I said, now what do I do? I actually asked him, was it customary at the time to be named with the mother or with the father? Something that I forgot to mention was my biological parents were not married at the time. And that was told to me in the non-identifying information. So my question was Busen likely my biological mother's last name or my biological father's last name? And he told me that it was probably my biological mother's last name. So now I know I was looking for a Karen Busen. I actually, because I was at the library, I went back to the library and I went to the phone book, went to the microfilm and looked up the Manhattan phone book for 1966, the year I was born, and sure enough, there was a Karen Busen in the phone book. Now, very important point here is then I went to the 1993 phone book, and I just looked up Busen. There was no there was no Karen Busen, but there were only 3 names in the phone book. In the New York City phone book with the name Busen, B-U-Z-I-N. So I knew that I was looking for a name that wasn't popular. My last name is Williams, and had I been looking for a Williams, I might still be looking, but I knew I was looking for a name that was not very common. So my time in New York had essentially expired, and I was headed back to Maine, and I had one more piece of information that came to me from the person I was working with in New York. He said, here's the name of a company in Tennessee, of all places, that will help you do a search by name and will give you phone numbers and addresses. Again, this is before the internet. So he gave me the phone number, and for a certain price, they'll run a list of names, first name, last name, address, and phone number. And so I gave them the name Busen, and I asked them to do a nationwide search, and it came back with 24 names. So, these names were sorted by zip code. So they started in the Northeast, worked its way down to the South, and then it worked its way west. And so, to give you a sense of time, we are now in January of 1994. I'm back in my last year at graduate school. I was living in a residence hall because I was working for the Department of Residential Life. And I started making some phone calls. Now, it's very important to remember that I had to be very careful about who I called, and because these people may not know who I was. I could have been a big, deep, dark secret. As it turns out, and for the sake of time, I'll condense this a little bit, I ended up finding a woman who led me to Karen Busen. And after a little bit of back and forth, obviously she was very reluctant to give me her relationship. But I eventually found a woman who knew her. And I had given this lady that I talked to on the phone from this list my contact information. And as it turns out, the woman I was talking to was named Marion. And Marion, let's see if you can follow this, Marion was married to my biological father, my biological grandfather. So Karen's father, my biological mother's father, my maternal grandfather, married this woman, but he married her late in life, and she knew nothing about me. So when I called her, she ended up calling Karen and saying, there's this guy from Maine, he's calling me, I have no idea what he's calling me about. And Karen said, she later told me that she wasn't sure what it was that triggered it, but she immediately knew what was happening. So it ends up that Karen ended up calling me. And I said, how did you find me? And she said, well, I found out through Marion. And then my biological father called me, Jeff. Now here's the story, that Karen and Jeff married shortly after I was born. After I was born and I was given up for adoption. They got married and had another child. So the big surprise was I have a sister who didn't know anything about me. And the sister, her name is Carrie, found out about me when I sort of emerged. And I met her in October of '94, later that year. I met my biological mother, I met my biological father, and then we maintained correspondence for a little while. And then I went to Carrie's wedding. And at Carrie's wedding, I met a whole room full of people that I was related to genetically, but I had no idea who they were. And as it turns out, as we have gone forward in time here, I've maintained a relationship with my biological sister, with Carrie. I've maintained a relationship with a biological uncle, with whom I see every time I travel to Washington, D.C. My biological mother and father, there's really no relationship there, but I was able to meet them and talk to them and get a lot of information. And it's been a very positive and good experience. A lot of people ask about my family, my brothers, my mother, and my father. They were very supportive. I was very fortunate. Both my mother and my youngest brother felt very threatened by this. My father and my other brother were concerned for my well-being, but weren't directly threatened. So the story continues, as all relationships do. It continues, and I hope to continue my relationship with as many members of my biological family as I can in the future. Thank you for listening.